Well, hey there, everybody. Ready for a little trip to the future? Today's deep dive, we're talking about the sun.
That's right. Specifically, what's going to happen to it billions of years from now.
And spoiler alert,
Oh,
it's not going to be pretty. Lucky for us, we've got Dr. Katie Mack's article as our guide. She's an astrophysicist, and she's got a real knack for making these huge cosmic ideas, well, fascinating.
and sometimes a little scary.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so I gotta ask, have you ever heard people say the sun's gonna explode like a supernova? Big, dramatic kaboom, the whole 9 yards.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a pretty popular idea, even though it's not um, exactly accurate.
Right, that's what I thought. So Dr. Mack, she sets the record straight right away. No supernova for our sun.
Nope, not going to happen.
Okay, so why not? What determines if a star goes supernova or not?
Well, there are a couple of ways a star can go supernova, but our sun just doesn't fit the bill for either one. One way is if it's massive enough, way bigger than our sun. The other way is if it's got a companion star nearby. Kind of setting the stage for some explosive interactions.
Ah, okay. So our sun's not big enough to go supernova on its own, and it doesn't have a dance partner to cause any cosmic drama.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's flying solo out there, and it's not massive enough for a solo supernova.
Well, that's a relief.
Yeah.
Sort of. But I have a feeling this is where the not so pretty part comes in. Because even though there's no supernova, the sun's not just going to stay the same forever, right?
Definitely not. We got to remember, the sun is basically a giant fusion reactor, always running, converting hydrogen to helium in its core. And that's what creates all the light and heat we get here on Earth.
Right, right. Fusion, the sun's power source. But even the biggest power sources, they run out of fuel eventually, right?
Exactly. And when our sun starts getting low on hydrogen fuel, well, things are going to get interesting.
Interesting how, is it just going to start to, dim out, get a little cooler?
Oh, no. It's much more dramatic than that. See, as the hydrogen in the core gets used up, the outward pressure that keeps the sun stable, well, that starts to decrease. And then the core, it starts to contract under its own gravity.
So it's like letting the air out of a balloon, except instead of just shrinking, things get more intense.
Exactly. The core contracts, and as it contracts, it heats up even more. And here's where it gets crazy. That intense heat from the core, it actually causes the sun's outer layers to expand outward. And that's how the sun transforms into what's called a red giant.
A red giant. Okay, how giant are we talking here?
Big enough to engulf Mercury and Venus completely.
Wait, whoa, hold on. The sun gets that big.
It does. As our sun transitions into a red giant, it expands massively. It's pretty hard to even imagine.
So I'm guessing this red giant phase, it's not exactly great news for Mercury and Venus.
Yeah, you could say that again.
And what about Earth? What happens to our little blue planet when the sun turns red giant?
Well, that's still a bit of a mystery, to be honest. Some models show that Earth might actually get engulfed by the sun. Others suggest that Earth's orbit might shift outward enough to avoid that fiery fate.
So either we get fried or we just end up incredibly far away from a much bigger, much brighter sun. And I'm guessing neither option is particularly good for life as we know it.
You're catching on quickly. Even before the red giant phase reaches its peak, the sun's energy output is going to be much, much higher. And that alone will cause some major changes here on Earth. We're talking oceans boiling away kind of changes.
Okay, yeah. I'm officially starting to feel a little existentially nervous now.
Right.
So we've got this red giant sun, maybe with a side of cosmically toasted Earth. What happens next? Is that it? End of story. So last time, we left off with our sun going through a bit of a growth spurt.
Yeah, that whole red giant thing. Not exactly a great look for its closest neighbors.
No, not at all.
But what happens after that? Does the sun just, stay a red giant forever?
Well, no, not forever. Even giants, they run out of steam eventually.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so during the red giant phase, the sun is fusing helium into heavier elements, but eventually that fuel runs out too. Ah, okay, so it's like running out of gas and then switching to the reserve tank. And
Exactly. The reserve tank runs dry. And when that happens, the sun's outer layers, well, they're no longer held together by that outward pressure from the fusion. So they kind of just drift off into space.
Drift off. So it's like the sun just, I don't know, exhales really hard.
It's kind of like that, yeah. But instead of a puff of air, it's this incredible, colorful cloud of gas and dust.
Whoa, okay.
Astronomers, they call them planetary nebulas, which is a little misleading because they don't actually have anything to do with the planets.
Huh.
But they are stunningly beautiful.
Okay, I admit, a giant glowing cloud of sun stuff.
Huh.
That's pretty amazing. But what about the sun's core? What happens to all that, Super concentrated matter at the center, after the outer layers drift off, I mean.
That's where things get really interesting. That core, it basically becomes the leftover embers of the sun,
Oh.
all compressed into this incredibly dense object. And that's what we call a white dwarf.
A white dwarf. You know, the name makes it sound kind of small and, I don't know, kind of cute.
Yeah, don't let the name fool you. Imagine something with the mass of our sun squeezed into a sphere about the size of Earth.
Oh.
That's a white dwarf. Incredibly dense, incredibly hot, and its gravity off the charts.
Okay, yeah, maybe not so cute after all. So that's it, right? The white dwarf is like the sun's final act. It just kind of cools down over time.
Well, that's the general idea. With no more fusion happening, a white dwarf slowly radiates away its heat. But this process, it takes billions of years. And eventually, yeah, it fades into what we call a black dwarf.
So the sun goes out, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Kind of a bummer ending after all that red giant excitement.
It might seem that way, but there's a twist. Remember those blood on the jaws clues Dr. Mack mentioned?
Oh, yeah. That did send a bit of a shiver down my spine. What was that about again?
Well, you see, astronomers have been studying white dwarfs for a while, and they've noticed something strange. When they look at the light from some of these white dwarfs, they see signatures of elements that, well, shouldn't be there.
Okay, like what?
Things like calcium, potassium, even iron.
Elements that don't belong in a star? That's like finding, I don't know, a toaster oven in the middle of the Sahara Desert. It's like, what's it doing there?
Exactly. And the most likely explanation is, well, it's fascinating
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit gruesome. You see, these elements, they're the remnants of planets. Planets that got a little too close to their dying stars.
Planets that got too close, you mean? You're telling me these white dwarfs, they pull in the remains of their own planets? That's kind of hardcore.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild story, right?
Yeah.
But it makes sense when you think about the whole red giant phase. I mean, remember how much the sun is going to expand?
Oh, yeah.
Well, when that happens, the orbits of the planets around it, they can get disrupted. Some planets, they might get flung out of the solar system entirely.
Just like ejected into the void.
Exactly. But others, they could actually spiral inwards towards the star.
So these planets, they're already dealing with all the chaos of a dying sun, and then they get pulled in by the intense gravity of the white dwarf. Talk about a double whammy.
Right. It's not a good place to be, that's for sure. And you've got to remember, white dwarfs are incredibly dense. So dense that any planetary material that gets pulled in, it doesn't just sit on the surface or anything, it actually gets incorporated into the star's outer layers.
Wow. So it's like the white dwarf, it's like it eats the planet and then wears its leftovers.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's how astronomers can actually figure out that this has happened.
What do you mean?
Well, they analyze the light from the white dwarf, and that's how they find those out-of-place elements, like we were talking about before. Those elements, they're like a cosmic fingerprint. They tell the story of the white dwarf's, well, cannibalistic past.
Okay, that's both fascinating and more than a little terrifying. So I gotta ask, bringing it back to our solar system, billions of years from now, what will our sun as a white dwarf, what will it look like to some alien astronomer out there?
Well, first off, they might see that faint, ghostly glow of the planetary nebula. You know, the one we were talking about?
Yeah.
The one that was formed when the sun's outer layers drifted off. But of course, over billions of years, that nebula will be slowly fading into the void. And at its heart, they'd see it. The ember of our sun, a white dwarf.
And maybe, just maybe, it'll have like a little bit of Earth mixed in.
Exactly. They might even be able to detect hints of iron, which would be a telltale sign of a planet that once had a molten core, a planet that, well, once supported life.
Wow. It's kind of a beautiful thought, actually. The story of our planet imprinted on the very light of our dying star. Like a cosmic message in a bottle, just drifting through the vastness of space.
It really is. It makes you realize that even though our time here is finite, even though planets and stars eventually fade away, the stories they tell, the echoes of their existence, they can last for billions of years, traveling across unimaginable distances.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Well, on that note, thanks for taking this deep dive with me. It's been, well, enlightening, to say the least.
My pleasure. These cosmic mysteries, they're always so much fun to explore, even if they do make us feel a little bit small sometimes.
That they do. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey through the life and eventual demise of our sun. It's a good reminder that the universe is constantly changing, evolving on timescales that, well, they completely dwarf our own. Until next time, keep looking up, keep asking questions, and keep exploring the wonders of the cosmos.